Okay, painting students, as you can see, I've got my rooster here. He is drawn and he is ready to go ahead and start adding color. Sorry, the video has a couple of weird little shadows in it. Still trying to figure out the best place to put the camera so that you guys can see the entire image all at once. But what I'm going to be doing is once I finish erasing all of my grid lines, once you guys finish erasing all of your grid lines, you will be ready to start adding color. Now remember, you can use watercolor, you can use acrylic paint, or a combination of the two. You can use colored pencils and markers in there at times, but I do want these to primarily be a painted project. So I've got some watercolors here, I've got my salt and my alcohol, and I've got a jar of water with some brushes in it. And the first thing that I'm going to be doing is the background. And then once that dries, I'll be able to go in and work on the actual rooster. But the reason for that is because you always want to work with whatever is furthest back and work your way up. Because the rooster is literally in front of the background. So if I paint him sort of on top of the background, then that will enhance the space that makes him look like he is in front. Now that being said, just because I'm doing the background first and then moving into the rooster does not mean that I cannot go back and work into the background as needed. And I will definitely be talking about that some more. You will see me work back into the background. Just because when you are working on a painting or really any type of project, you want to make sure that you are working sort of interchangeably on the whole thing. Do not try to develop one part of a painting or drawing and then move on to the next. It's all relative, so what you're going to be doing is sort of developing the entire painting as a group, or as a unit, I should say. So I'm not going to finish one part before I move to the next. I'm going to get them to an equal point of resolution and then move to the next part so that the whole painting develops as a unit, since it will affect each other. The way that I paint the background will affect the way that I paint the rooster. The way that I paint the rooster affects the way the background looks. So there will be some back and forth. So right now what I'm doing is just going ahead and painting the background space here with water. Just getting it good and wet. Because I am planning on using some of the watercolor techniques that we've been practicing in class to make that background more interesting. And I'm also going to use some of what we've talked about with the elements and principles of art, because I'm going to use complementary colors, and I'm going to make my background mostly green. Since a lot of the rooster will be red, I figure the green is a good choice as a background to help make the red parts of the rooster pop, and to just kind of bring in that nice strong contrast that complementary colors has. So because this paper is pretty large, I'm not going to wet the whole page all at once, because if I try to do that, then chances are it would dry up before I could get to it. So using the same palettes you guys are going to use, I'm just going to get one of my greens good and wet, and I'm just going to go ahead and start putting some of that green down. I'm just going to let it kind of swirl around in there. I'm going to go ahead and get the other green wet as well. And remember, you can use the white space on the lid of your painter's palette for sort of mixing colors. Right now I'm just putting some green down as is and letting them mix directly into the paper. The paper will curl up a little bit. Just try to ignore that. It's very frustrating at times, I know. And we can tape these down to Masonite to help that not happen as much, but it will still happen a little bit. So it's just good to go ahead and be aware that it's going to happen and just be okay with that. The more water you have on there, the more it happens. So obviously at this step, where I am putting quite a lot of water to start on the background, it's going to happen quite a bit. So I'm going to actually put a little bit of red in part of the screen. because I don't want it to be too bright. I want part of the green to be a little bit more muted. And you'll see that the paint is getting on the table a little bit. Don't worry too much about that at this point. We can clean that up. Watercolor is very easy to clean up. I'm just going to move some of this green around. Remember, I can also just actually move the paper, and the green will move. Now notice that I'm trying to let this edge stay kind of soft, so that when I go up there and add more pigment later on, I don't have like a harsh edge that I don't want. So just putting a good bit of pigment on the page right now. It is darker around his face, but I'm not worried about that at this point. I can change it later on if I feel the need to, or it might be that I end up liking it dark around his face. So I'm not going to worry too much about that right now. I am going to go ahead and put some salt down. Just going to kind of sprinkle it on there. And remember, you don't necessarily have to use the techniques that we've been doing in class, but it is a nice chance to use them in a painting and kind of see how they affect it. So now I'm just going to go ahead and move on to other parts of this while it's still wet. I'm going to go ahead and go to this side. You could definitely just continue right up along this edge and connect to the wet areas, but what I'm going to do is let that dry a little bit, let the paper stop curling quite as much, and then go back to that area. So you'll see that my water is a little bit green now, but since my background is still green, that does not bother me at all. I'm going to scooch this over so you guys can see better. And yes, that does mean that I just got paint on the back of my paper, but it'll dry. It's not that big a deal. So just getting this good and wet. On this part, I'm going to leave parts of it not as wet, so that you can see the difference between using a fully wet page and a partially wet page. So I'm going to go ahead and go into that dry area with some green. So you'll see that it stays much more saturated in the areas where I'm putting that paper, or putting the paint directly onto the paper. But then when I get towards the water, it will still spray. So that's one nice way of being able to kind of create a darker value in certain places, but still leaving it be light and let it spread in others. And I can add more water if I need, I can add more paint. Because I plan on using alcohol on this side, I wanted to make sure I had some sections that were a little more heavily saturated, so that the alcohol would have more of an effect. So you can see the red and the green there making each other really vibrant, but also making brown where they mix, because complementary colors will make brown when mixed. I'm going to put a little bit of blue in here, some really dark blue, a bit of a bluish green. Now you can absolutely use the background that is on your reference image, or you can completely make one up the way I am to use one of the elements. It's completely up to you. Some of you have talked to me about leaving your background white. That is an okay option. You just want to be very specific about why you are leaving it white, so that you have an actual valid reason, not just leaving it white because you don't want to paint it. You want to make sure that you are leaving it white as a choice based on your image. So right now I'm just kind of having this fade out into the paper color so that I don't end up with any edges that I don't want. Gonna go ahead and do that a little more on this side too. Continue to spread that out. And then I am going to go ahead and drip some alcohol in there. Keeping in mind that I'm probably going to have to do these techniques more than once to get the full level of saturation that I want on some of these places. So yes, that splattered his eye and his face a little bit, but I'm not too concerned about it. I kind of like that splatter, to be honest. So that may be something to consider. You may end up having a mistake that you didn't mean to do, but you may end up liking it. So by all means, remember how you made that mistake, and then you can intentionally recreate it if you choose. There we go. So now I'm just going to work back into the top section of my paper a little bit more. Bring in a little more green, fade this out a little bit. So first I'm just going to kind of soften it so that it gets gradually back to the white of that paper and stays that sort of pale green up here at the top. Because I don't want my background to just be like the same green throughout the whole thing, because that's going to be a little bit too boring. There's not going to be much variety, and there's not going to be as much depth and space if the whole background is exactly the same. If you vary the background a little bit, it's going to have more space, it's going to be more interesting, plus it will usually result in a stronger painting. Not necessarily always, but it usually will. And obviously one of the sort of double-edged sword things about watercolor is that we won't really know what this looks like until it dries. Because once it dries, I'll be able to scratch off the salt. We'll see the full effect of the watercolor. The colors will stop mingling. Until then, we only have an idea of what it's going to look like. So definitely something to be aware of when you are using watercolor. What it looks like at each stage affects the overall result, but does not necessarily determine the overall result. Which is another reason why we often will work in layers, pretty much always, honestly, to allow for those changes to happen. So now I'm just going to sort of drop some color into that water section. So now I'm just going to let that dry, and then once that part of my background is dry, I'll know if there's more that I want to do on the background, what changes I might want to make, and I would want to make sure that I have my background pretty far along before I work into the rooster himself. But then I can also still work on the background more as needed later on into the project. And if some of this area happened and you want to go ahead and get rid of it because you know that you don't like it, just get a paper towel, soak it up, and it will lighten itself up because some of that pigment will be lifted. So I will show you that. So if you just hold the paper towel and kind of press the corner of it in, it's going to soak up some of that color. You will usually have to do it more than once to make it truly lighter. So then doing that will allow me to see his eye again a little bit more. And then I can also kind of dab there. So I can see sort of where his eye is, where it got covered up with the paint, but I have not fully changed the way that that background looks there. So once again, once the background is dry, I'll scratch the salt off and we'll know sort of how to proceed from there. So it's definitely a multi-step process and takes a bit of patience.